All right, this is Lorrie Beck. She is a retired anthropologist. Is that okay to describe you as a retired anthropologist, I think? And she is an alumni from Fresno State. Lorrie, can you tell us the name of your tribe, what Native American tribe you are in California?
I am Choinumni. It's Choinumni, and I'm also Mono.
All right. I'm really excited to introduce Lorrie to all of you. She has something that she would like to share with you. Each semester, we bring Native American Indian artists and artisans and just of a variety of people that have a rich history to talk about. And I would like to just introduce Lorrie to you. And here she is. Okay, go ahead, Lorrie.
Thank you, Jamie. Well, my name is Lorrie Beck, as Jamie said, and I am Choinumni and Mono Indian. And like you, I attended Fresno State. I picked up an anthropology degree at Fresno State, and then I went forward and picked up a master's degree in anthropology also. I've worked in a number of areas that have to do with Indian people in general, Indian education and such. And after I graduated, I went to work for the Sierra National Forest as a district archaeologist and also the tribal relations program manager. And I managed thousands of sites that are located on our Sierra Nevada mountains that are situated on the Sierra National Forest managed land. And so I also worked with the local tribes that continue to carry on traditions that are happening on Forest Service federal lands. And so I've worked with enough tribes, and there are a number of different types of ceremonies they still hold on federal lands. One of them, for example, is they walk the trails that their ancestors walked in a traditional way and meet. And then they conduct something that is called a bear dance ceremony. It's a sort of a celebration of the harvest, the fall harvest, and particularly a focus on the acorn. Your instructor asked me to speak to you about a law that affects Native Americans, and it interfaces with science and Indians. Did you know that there are more laws addressing Native Americans than any other ethnic group in the United States? We have our own department called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And there is a special relationship between Native Americans and the US government. And that is the reason there are so many laws and so many things that have to be looked at. So when I talk to you about this law, I'm going to give you some information on it more so later on, because I want to be able to provide a bit of a context for why this law came about. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about anthropology in general. There are several areas in the discipline of anthropology. There's archaeology, linguistics, physical anthropology, cultural anthropology. The one that particularly is related to this law has mainly to do with the archaeology program. And I think archaeology is something that is familiar to most students and most people, because archaeology's been in movies, it's been on TV, and there's always something about finding hidden treasures that archaeologists are out digging for. But basically, archaeologists dig specifically in the ground, looking at the past, and then they try to reconstruct the past, and they combine that information along with what cultural anthropologists do. And cultural anthropologists mainly deal with living people. And then they try to recreate the whole history of a people. And so archaeologists, for example, have written hundreds, probably thousands of books on California Indians, and certainly Indians from throughout the whole of the United States. But I became particularly interested because, you know, anthropologists have that expertise to be able to study cultures. And I was just moving in the direction of wanting to learn more about my tribe, and also just learning about tribes in general. And of course, looking to see how there are ways that I could contribute towards more information and more sharing of culture. However, there has not always been a good relationship between Native people and anthropologists, and particularly archaeologists. And if you're not familiar with their history, I'm going to give you a little bit I'm going to give you a little background about that relationship. So I want to give you some basic tenets of Native Americans. First of all, Native Americans in the Americas are the first peoples here. So in other words, they are the indigenous people of the United States and of the Americas, also referred to as the Aboriginal people. And so you might ask about how long were Native Americans in the United States, in the Americas? And I can tell you that at least 15,000 years. They may push that back to 20,000 years ago, but Native Americans were here when the megafauna was here. In other words, if you're familiar with the saber-toothed tiger, the mammoth, the short-faced bear, referred to in general as megafauna, and mega meaning big, a native person would have come up to perhaps the barely the shoulder of one of these big animals. And so you take a big animal, and you take a humans that are only coming up to, barely coming up to the shoulders. You understand that they had to learn to survive in a very different world than what we're familiar with today. And one of the ideas, theories they have of what happened to this megafauna and all, your saber-toothed tiger and mammoth, was that the Indians killed them off. That was kind of one theory, and that's becoming less and less before. But can you imagine what that experience would be like to hunt something as large as the megafauna? Around 11,000 years ago, the megafauna disappeared, and they're dated to about that time of their extinction, their going away. So Native Americans arrived here, and people wonder, well, how is it that they came? Well, they certainly couldn't fly as we can today, so they obviously came either by boat or by land. And those are the two main theories that are sort of in existence today. The one that has been around, for quite a while, and that a lot of people are familiar with, is the crossing of the land bridge that used to exist and connected Eurasia with North America. So when I say a land bridge, I'm talking about there was at one time a large ice sheet that was miles wide that connected this area. So they're thinking that possibly they may have come in waves, possibly following the megafauna as they came here also. And so through either boat or land, they began to spread everywhere throughout the Americas and everywhere throughout the United States. So you have your tribes that are all the way on the East Coast that at one time greeted the newcomers and in fact helped them survive. and you have them populating the plains areas. You know, the tribes that a lot of people are familiar with are, for example, your Cherokee, your Sioux, the Navajo, and the Apache that are in the southwestern part of the United States. California was one of the last areas to be taken over by the newcomers to this land. And I say newcomers because the United States is not very old, right? And if you compare that to having been in a land for 15,000 years, that's a very short time. When I worked with the Forest Service, one of the things that I worked on were interdisciplinary teams in which we had hydrologists, soil scientists, wildlife biologists, hydrologists, geologists, ecologists, a lot of people that knew a lot of science about the land. But what I think that I can tell you is that in those 15,000 years of living on the land, the native people became experts at what they did. They became experts because they didn't have stores to go shopping and buy the things they needed. Everything they made, they had to learn from scratch, which meant they had to learn their entire environment, the trees, the land, the animals, the birds, everything. And then they had to rely on them in order to survive. So we speak about an intimate relationship between native peoples and the land. And you will often hear the expression in Indian country, Mother Earth. Well, when your entire existence is dependent on being able to live off of the earth, you develop a very close relationship with it. And you develop a close relationship with the animals and with the air and the water. And that intimacy creates a sense of belonging and a sense of a spiritual tie with the land and with the sources that provide that. And so each tribe, and there are thousands of tribes, right? We had at one time, well, today around 150 just in California. So the tribes spread all over. Some tribes have much more of a larger land base than we do in California, but they learn to become dependent. They learn to respect their lands and love their land. And I know that sometimes in the course of history, archaeologists and others sort of looked at native peoples and throughout the world as somewhat primitive. But primitive is a relative word. You're going to have to understand what, if you were sent out into the woods to make a living, you probably wouldn't do it unless you had expert people with you showing you how to live on this land. The other component that I want to talk to you just briefly about is the unique status that native peoples have in terms of genetics. Native peoples have a unique DNA. And what I mean by that is that you cannot take the DNA of a native person and trace it to anywhere else in the world. Their DNA is tied to this land, to this people. So as if you go to ancestry.com and sign up and use your saliva to trace your DNA, you may find your DNA that's tied to other parts of the world. But when you come up and you are Native American, it will say Native American. That is your DNA. And I think that's something that we're learning more and more as we become more doing more DNA research. There's not a lot of information available about the DNA of Native peoples because Native peoples have been very reluctant to give their DNA. And it probably is tied to their history and the relationship to how they have been treated in the world. They're not quite sure what's going to come of it. And the reason is because most of you students have had history courses to get through high school and to get through college. And so you know that the Americas, or America was the United States, newcomers came just a few hundred years ago, European waves of newcomers. And they took over the land. I really don't know any other way to say it. They came thinking there was nobody here, that they were finding a new land, and came to find that it was populated everywhere they went. And if you look at the history of America, it's quite a shameful history in terms of how they treated the native indigenous people. It's a history of outright warfare. It's a history of trying to work together, but also a lot of people coming with the attitude that this is new land, this land is our land. And the native peoples fought back, as you know, your Crazy Horse, your Geronimo stories, your Trail of Tears. It is repeated over and over again. The Indians fought back, but they did not have the ability. They didn't have the warfare. They didn't have the military means by any source of the imagination to be able to keep anybody out. And so, as you know, the story goes that as the United States became very much the United States, the Indian people were put on reservations, moved to reservations, many of them forced removal. In California, not quite as much. You have a lot of Indian people that still have some ties to their land, but throughout the United States, there are a lot of people that have been uprooted. And on top of that, the Europeans and other waves of immigrants introduced diseases that the peoples in the Americas had no immunity to. So for example, in California, over 90% of the population died. A big part of it to the introduced diseases, and then also to the outright a warfare that was going on and such. So in California, because the population dropped so much, historians actually viewed the natives as fading as the winter snow. So, but you know, we're still here, and it's a different world today. What ended up coming between the United States and the Indian tribes are what is called a government-to-government relationship. So those tribes that are in the United States have what is called an actual federal relationship with the US government. And that is probably partly why there are so many laws that affect Native Americans that don't affect a lot of other people, because the tribes are like a government within a larger government. The United States government allows Indian people to, on their own reservation or rancheria, to govern themselves. So they vote themselves, they vote their own people in. If the tribe is large enough, as some of them are, there's only a few in California, but in other places, they have their own judicial system. So if when you enter Indian country, is what it's called, and enter a reservation, you're under, especially if they have a judicial system, you're under a different jurisdiction. So it's not like you're going to a foreign country, of course, but you are entering a special place that falls under a special relationship and special laws. So I'm not quite sure how much government to government relationships are taught in schools, but that is what defines the relationship between Indian people today. And also, you should know that not all Indians live on reservations. In fact, particularly in California, most Indians are not living on reservations. And I think that, you know, a part of it is by choice, and a part of it in California particularly is that there's just not enough space. There just simply isn't, because some of the rancherias are really just a few acres large, maybe some maybe as large as 80 acres and 100 acres, but just not that. In terms of the relationships, the governor of California last year actually made a formal apology for the genocide and the taking of the land that was taken from the tribes. When the tribes were put on these reservations, then the rest of the land went to the rest of the people, to the non-Native American people that came to share our land together. Since this is an art class, and so when some of you look at contemporary art or art that's been done through time, because of the history of the Native Americans in the United States, you might often see expressions of sadness, of a sad history, of a struggle, of a struggling people. And you will also see art that deals with a celebration of their culture, a celebration of their long history, a celebration of, you know, like, for example, a lot of the dress that you will see, that dress comes from a long history of knowing animals, knowing songs related to those animals, a celebration of their lives, a celebration of that relationship, and you know, the use of a lot of natural things that are in the environment within their display of who they are. I think that in art, there is also an opportunity for healing. So healing involves sharing your culture. Healing involves talking about the way that things have been and the struggles that you've been through. And I think that your instructor also talked to you about James Luna, the artist James Luna, and the way that he tried to emphasize to people that Indian people are still here. You don't recognize them if they are not in their regalia. And so I know that one of his exhibits, he said, would you like to take a picture with a real Native American? And so I think that there are challenges for art to be able to talk about the way that people have an opportunity to express their culture and use it also as an opportunity for growth for both the public and for the Indian artists themselves. So I'd like to just ask your instructor for a moment if she has any questions or ideas or anything else, because then I'm going to just shift into the NAGPRA part. Now that you have a little bit of an idea of why we would be talking about a law that affects Native Americans with its history, and hopefully this little bit of background talks to you about the relationship between science and between people and between why Native artists reach back into their past to bring their culture forward and share that culture with people today. So, would you like me to just shift on into the NECRA part
I
at
think
this
so.
point?
The only thing I did want to ask you was when you said that 90% of the population died as a result of disease. Do we have any idea of that number? Do we have any, like, how,
You mean in terms of total number of people?
like an idea?
Wow. That one is a hard one because when they first tried to do a population of people, they were trying to figure maybe only about 30,000 people were here, and they've never really, I don't know that they've really figured that one out. You will have some people who will say that Native peoples were here in the millions. And so California is kind of unique because all of the other tribes that are found throughout the North America are also found in California. Over 15,000 years, you have a lot of different languages that developed. And all of those different languages you will see represented in California, which I think kind of speaks to California being a place that people liked to come and see. I have a very varied climate, right? Very varied climate. So, the article that you would have read it revolves around the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. And in that article, you would have read that for decades, archaeologists were digging up human remains in the course of doing their livelihood and their discipline. And rather than leaving them there, they hauled them back to universities, museums, and other institutions. And so for a very long time, Indian people had no right to ask for them back. And it took a long time for tribes to develop the laws and to figure out the best way to do it, to actually work at something like trying to retrieve, to get back and rebury their ancestors. So here we are in 1990, having a law that said it's time to give the remains back to the Indian people. It was a good positive thing because it's been really slow in Indian country for the government to give Indian people rights. And the Native people did not get the right to vote until 1924. They did not get the right to practice their religion until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which was in the 60s. So by 1990, they're gaining the right to get their remains back. But what came with this law were so many challenges to it, so many battles that happened between the archaeologists and those that wanted to study old remains and the Indian people, and of course the government, that, as you read in the article, it was even taken all the way to the Supreme Court. And then the scientists won the right to continue to study, and then lo and behold, they find out that indeed they are Native American and not another group of people that they thought may have made it to the Americas. And they're finding, maybe some, like, for example, one of them, they thought that they were some people from Japan, off an island that was controlled by Russia, because these people did not look like the traditional Japanese people. They had European features about them. And as it turned out, they were indeed Native American. And you saw in the other examples where more and more DNA is being done and more Indian people are being more comfortable about sharing that so that they can bring some of their ancestors home. When I was a student at Fresno State, I had to take an osteology class in order to get my degree. I might have been able to get out of it, but I took the class and I did not realize that I was indeed going to possibly be studying some of my ancestors, because the professor ended up coming into the classroom and bringing these trays of human remains. And when I saw these remains, and then he provided the information that they came from excavations, and they were local excavations from 5 counties around us, I was quite nervous. I didn't exactly know what to do. So I said to those remains that I will do everything that I can to bring those remains, to come back and honor those remains and do what I could to get them out of a university and get them reburied. And of course, this was before NAGPRA. And in the course of time, that happened. And as soon as that law was passed, well, then the tribes in our area began working on it. And it took quite a few years from the time the law was passed until the remains were actually returned for them to be finally reburied. Today, it's a human rights issue. It's interesting the way that laws can force people to have to stop and look at what rights people have and what rights did a museum do museums have to continue to hold these remains. But here we are 30 years later, and there are still, unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of remains still in institutions. And right now I am working with the University of California at Berkeley to see what we can continue to do about getting those remains back. They have about 7,000 ancestors there. It's quite a large number. But my own personal experience of working with places, I mean, I myself have helped to rebury hundreds of ancestors just in our local communities, because we've prevented them from being buried. Those that were dug up have been reburied. So I think in our Central Valley, we're doing pretty good. When you talk about how different cultures see the world, this is really a prime example of how scientists can fight for the right to use human remains as specimens, to not look at them as people who were buried by their families and ceremonies done and things that belong to them buried with them, and people spending days and nights helping them pass from this world into the next. And to not give that level of honor or respect to those ancestors. So it's still a battle today. I think that old statement of how a culture sees their world determines their institutions is a strong statement about culture. And the more we learn to think about how other people feel and think about their world, and the way that we can look at building better relationships between cultures and between people, and between ourselves, I think the better we'll make this world. And people don't have to have those experiences that Native people are going to be experiencing for quite a few years to come. But I can see a difference today. Now, I'm in my mid 70s. I can see a difference of attitude just between the researchers and the archaeologists and the scientists of the past and the scientists of today. I can see that they're understanding the aspect of it being a human right. And the world is a much more bigger world. We see the entire world today on television all the time. We see the violations of human rights, and we need to see how best we can to not put more on people than they need to be able to have to understand and have to go through in their lives. It's hard to see the faces of elders who still see the struggles that need to move forward. I mean, when I was doing this, I was a lot younger person, and I'm an elder today, and I still see the need for things to continue to grow and for us to do it. I think that art is a wonderful way to express feelings, and for Indian people, for Native art to be able to share their history and their cultural experiences. And I think it's a good opportunity for people that are going to museums or that are studying art to see it as an opportunity to share their experiences and be able to see the world in a different way. So that kind of concludes sort of what I wanted to say today, unless there are some other questions that, I think it's a kind of a hard thing for students to sit and listen to this talking head in front of them, right?
Well, it's very rich. I really appreciate you coming and speaking to us and just talking about your experiences. I was wondering, I think, which we'll talk about it in the class and I'll give them some more information. I think one thing though is it's probably even today hard for students to even imagine the numbers of the native skeletal remains that were in these institutions. Can you give us a number? I mean, I know numbers in your estimation, because I've read that Smithsonian was incredible. I mean, we're not talking just a few here and there, right?
No, I mean, you look at Berkeley, you see Berkeley itself, and there are 7,000 ancestors there. Hmm. And the law does not make it really easy. It's not a matter of, does your tribe affiliate itself? Are you related to it? When you talk about 15,000 years and someone says, how do you draw back to these people that are probably 4,000 or 5,000 years? And then you look at the history of disruption through time. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, it's difficult to try for even the tribes to be able to do that. So the laws have been made easier and easier for Indian people to make that claim and to give them back. And so to say hundreds of thousands, I know that they're still there, and they are slowly being repatriated back to the tribes. But yeah, the numbers it's just kind of staggering in the mind to think how many remains have been dug up. I mean, the artifacts and the remains fill museums. I mean, they fill museums because they have to box all these remains. And one thing that is even staggering, even taking the people from our communities to Fresno State, the boxes were all stored in one room, and a number of Indian people got together and they made cloth. They purchased cloth and they draped all the boxes. So when the boxes were carried out and placed on the bus that was going to take them to where they were going to be reburied, they were all draped in cloth that had been prepared. And still we filled a bus. We still filled a school bus of all of the boxes that contained the 140 plus remains that were stored at Fresno State. So it's, when you think of just having to bury hundreds, the goal of having to bury thousands and thousands becomes a major task in itself. And I think that the institutions where they are being stored, for example, Berkeley owns a lot of land, and a lot of the land that they own was Indian land. And so they're going to work to try to find more and more ways to get those reburials done. But a large number staggers the mind, in fact.
Mhm.
I mean, it's when you walk in a place that's holding thousands of remains, you're basically walking into a cemetery.
Exactly. Exactly. A
Right.
mausoleum. Yeah, I think it is really hard for us to put our mind around it. And even, I think, I have my own theory, which I have to talk to you by myself about it.
Okay,
Before
we'll do
you
that.
tell me if I'm wrong or if I'm right. You know, I don't feel brave enough to mention it. But I mean, I do. One of the things I think is interesting for students to even. I think it's just so. It's just something. It's so interesting because it's something we don't really realize. You know, we didn't know. Many people didn't realize this is going on. Most of us. And the idea of the NAGPRA happening, most people don't know about that.
Yeah, correct.
So I feel really thankful that you're here to share this with the students in such a manner that they can even understand and because, you know, like I told you, it's a large group of students that run through this course, and I think that this is information that we all need to have, because if knowledge is power, right? I mean, there's just in knowing what is going on and trying to, maybe you never know, being in that position to make that difference. So I want to ask you about Fresno State, just a little bit about Fresno State, because here we are, students from Fresno State. Can you tell us a bit of the stories about your involvement in retrieving the skeletal remains of the Native people here in California? Was it hard for you? Was there a struggle? Were there any, or did it just kind of flow easily and they just said, okay, here you go?
Dealing with human remains is not an easy thing. I think that if people have a hard time going to funerals, and people have a hard time dealing with dead people. In Indian country, when a person dies on many of the rancherias, they're still brought home. They're not left in the mortuaries. They're when the person dies, they will go to do what needs to be done legally. But when they get ready to be buried, they're going to be buried on Indian land, unless it's been done elsewhere. But they still bring them home here, and they still celebrate their lives here. So that connection with a dead body is treated a little bit differently in Indian country today. At least that's been my experience through the years, is that bring them home, dance around them, sing songs, share food, share memories. The young people are brought to be a part of that. Everybody is brought to be a part of that, and then the native songs that are sung and the things that are done help to tie the community together and to really move forward with dancing the person who has passed away into the other world. For when I got involved in working in situations where we received the remains of our ancestors from around here, not everybody wanted to participate in it because it's a hard thing to just handle human remains. So yeah, there is that struggle there, and it's also hard for people to even look at them, even when they've been dug up, and then see them, and it's just a different experience. And then unless you go through it, it's kind of hard to describe. I became very familiar with it and recognized that I'm doing something that I think that if that person were alive would be grateful that I am doing it. I think I can share one personal experience. When we had retrieved a number of remains that had come from the coroner's office, there were construction going on, and so we received the human remains, and we were going to try to figure out a place to put them. Well, let's see, I'm mixing that up with another one. We were trying to get the human remains, and they were still in storage. And my personal memory was having a dream where I saw a skeleton come out of a box and then sit down and kind of cross their legs and sit and like, how long is this going to take? Now that was a personal experience of mine that was like, yeah, it's a hardship, and what have people gone through for such a long time to go home, to go home and be somewhere where they're not going to just be stored in a box somewhere. Something is wrong. Let's move on with this. Yeah, that's kind of a personal experience of mine. But sharing other people's experiences, I've seen them where it's been very hard for people to even look at them, even in boxes. And today, even worth working in Berkeley, there are young people that are Native people who still don't really feel comfortable at all going into the room where the boxes of remains are stored. So it's still a struggle. Yeah. It's still a painful struggle.
When you would take the bodies and you'd bury them, do you feel that there was a sense of healing for the
yes,
for them?
Most definitely. The times that we've done it, there's songs that are sung. We had to go back to our elders and say, what do we do? How do we rebury these remains? We've never buried remains before. Some of the elders said, we'll create some songs similar to before, and you do this, and you put them in the ground and then sing the songs and then cover them up. So it's kind of a new experience for those of us who were younger and having to do that. And then also to have the elders there to support us. That was a really critical thing. Strong community support.
I love it.
If you want to hear something kind of funny and amusing, I remember going to one of the tribes one time to talk about something that we were going to need to do. And when I went into the office, one of the ladies at the front desk hollered back, the cemetery lady is here. So yeah, I got a little bit of an interesting label for a while. But yeah, it's a struggle. It's something that that you need to do. You move forward with it. It becomes easier, but you always understand that for a lot of people, it's going to be a sensitive subject.
Well, it's wonderful. Thank you so much. Gosh, it's so rich. I think I could just talk to you. I could let you talk for a couple more hours if you want.
I think the students are doing this.
They're always doing that with me. They're like, enough. All right, Lorrie. Well, I'm going to stop the recording, but I want to thank you so much for this time. It's so rich, and I'll definitely we'll talk though. I love this.
We'll stay in touch. Thank you very much. Okay.